It was a normal afternoon inside the central train station, the kind of afternoon where people rushed from one platform to another without looking at anyone around them. Suitcases rolled across the floor, announcements echoed from speakers, and workers hurried to grab a quick snack before returning to duty. In the middle of all this noise and movement sat an old, upright piano that the station had placed there years ago. Most of the time it stayed quiet, except when a bored traveler touched a few keys or a child pressed random notes for fun. Almost no one took it seriously. On this particular day, however, someone sat down at the piano with a sense of purpose. He was a man in his late 40s, dressed in simple clothes that made him blend into the background. He carried no fancy bags, no signs of being wealthy or important. His hair was slightly messy, and his jacket looked worn from long use. He seemed like someone you might pass by without noticing, someone who preferred silence and never tried to stand out. He placed his fingers on the keys gently, as if he was giving the piano time to wake up. At first, the notes that came out were soft and slow, almost like warm-up sounds. People walking nearby didn't even look up. They just kept moving. A woman with a phone pressed to her ear rushed past him. Two teenagers crossed right behind him, talking loudly about their weekend plans. A group of tourists stood a few feet away arguing about directions. No one cared about the man or the piano, but the man didn't seem to mind at all. He simply breathed in slowly and allowed his hands to settle. Then, almost like a quiet conversation with himself, he began playing a melody that drifted gently through the air. It wasn't a famous song or something people recognized. It was simple, warm, calm like the sound of early morning sunlight through a window. The kind of melody that didn't demand attention, but gently invited it. The first person to notice was a small child tugging at his mother's hand. He stopped walking when he heard the piano and turned his head. His mother tried to pull him along, but he refused to move. He stood there, eyes wide, listening as if the sound had opened a tiny door in his imagination. Eventually his mother gave in and let him watch for a moment. A few meters away, a young man in a worker's uniform paused while cleaning the floor. He had heard many people play the piano before, but this sound felt different. There was something calm and careful in the way the man touched the keys. Even the young worker, who was tired from hours of work, felt a bit lighter listening to it. One by one, more people started slowing down. A couple dragging their luggage stopped for a second. A vendor at a nearby snack counter leaned forward so he could hear better. Even the station guard, who usually stayed busy checking tickets, glanced in the man's direction. Still, the man continued to play without looking up. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. The way he played made it feel like the music was something he needed, something that came from inside him. Every note was gentle, as if he was letting a memory speak through his hands. The old piano, though scratched and faded, sounded beautiful in his control. He didn't press the keys with force. He pressed them with feeling. People didn't know who he was, but they could sense there was a story behind the way he played. After a few minutes, the melody changed slightly. It grew a little deeper, a little richer, the child watching him move closer. The couple with the luggage sat down on a nearby bench. The worker cleaning the floor slowed his movements without realizing it. The noise of the station seemed to soften around the music. As if the sound wrapped around the space and held it still, some travelers recorded short clips on their phones, thinking they had stumbled upon a hidden moment worth sharing. They whispered to each other quietly, wondering how someone who looked so ordinary could play with so much emotion, but the man didn't react to any of it. His eyes stayed focused on the keys, and his posture remained relaxed. It felt almost as though he and the piano were sharing a quiet moment that the rest of the world accidentally walked into as the melody flowed. People who had never met each other stood side by side, listening. A student who had been stressed about his exams felt a little calmer. A woman who had been arguing on the phone earlier paused and, for a moment, forgot what she was upset about. A tired traveler who had been waiting for a delayed train leaned back in her chair, letting the music wash over her. The station, usually filled with sharp footsteps and loud voices, felt strangely peaceful. Even the pigeons that often flapped around the ceiling beams stayed unusually quiet, as if the harmony had settled them too. The man's hands moved with steady confidence. He wasn't rushing the music or trying to show off. There was patience in every motion, like someone who had spent years speaking through sound instead of words. Some people wondered if he might be a professional musician, maybe someone who had performed in big halls before. Others thought he might be a teacher or someone who simply loved music deeply. The truth remained a mystery, and that mystery made people listen even more closely. A teenager who had been scrolling through his phone looked up and put it away. He didn't know why, but something about the music touched him. The tune felt familiar in a way he couldn't explain, like a memory he had forgotten but suddenly remembered. The sunlight shining through the tall station windows fell on the man's face, giving him a soft glow. He barely blinked, lost in the world he was creating with the piano. His shoulders moved slightly with the rhythm, and his expression stayed calm, almost peaceful. Few passengers waiting for their train approached quietly and formed a small circle around the piano. The sound had become the center of the station without forcing anything. It was gentle yet powerful enough to bring strangers together. The melody continued to grow deeper, as if telling a story without words. People listening could feel emotions they didn't even know they had. Some felt comfort. Some felt curiosity. Some felt inspired. And some simply enjoyed the beauty of the moment. What made it more special was how ordinary the man looked. If someone told the crowd that morning that the highlight of their day would be a simple-looking man at an old piano, they wouldn't have believed it. Yet here they were, watching him with full attention. The air in the station felt different, softer, calmer. Even the background announcements seemed to fade away for a moment. It was as if time had slowed down just enough for people to breathe again. The man shifted into another gentle part of the melody, one that felt almost nostalgic. The crowd didn't know it, but this piece was something personal to him, something from long ago. Each note carried a piece of memory, and though no one could see that memory, they felt its weight and warmth. By now, more people had gathered. Some stood with their hands in their pockets. Some leaned on their luggage. Some simply watched with quiet admiration. No one asked who he was. No one tried to interrupt. They just listened, letting the afternoon unfold in a way they hadn't expected. The station guard stepped closer, trying to see the man's face more clearly. He wasn't checking anything, he was simply moved by the music. The vendor at the snack counter rested his arms on the counter and sighed, enjoying the rare, peaceful moment. The child who had first stopped now sat cross-legged on the floor, completely absorbed. His mother, who originally wanted to hurry away, looked softer now, as if she was thankful she paused. A man in a business suit, who looked stressed from his busy schedule, closed his eyes for a moment and let the sound calm his thoughts. All these people, different backgrounds, different lives, different worries, found themselves sharing one moment created by one ordinary man and one old piano. And still, nobody knew who he was. He didn't smile, didn't make a grand gesture, didn't look for applause. He just kept playing, letting the music fill the space around him. The crowd didn't know that something unexpected was about to happen later, something that would make this moment even more astonishing. For now, they simply enjoyed the peaceful beauty of what they were hearing. The train station continued its usual routine in the background, but those who listened would remember this moment for a long time. They didn't know the man's story yet. They didn't know why he played with such feeling. They didn't know what was coming next. All they knew was that a quiet afternoon had turned unforgettable. The gentle melody the man had been playing began to change. At first, it was only a subtle shift. The soft, calm notes grew slightly stronger, and the rhythm became more confident. The people gathered around the piano noticed the difference immediately. The music was no longer just background sound. It demanded attention. There was something richer, more complex in the way the notes flowed together. It was as if the man was telling a story that no words could capture. The small child sitting on the floor moved closer, eyes wide in amazement. His mother, who had been leaning against a pillar, watched quietly. She didn't say a word, not wanting to interrupt the moment. Even the teenager who had put away his phone looked up with curiosity. The melody now had depth, and with each note, it seemed to carry emotion from another world. People began whispering softly among themselves. Almost afraid to break the spell, a few more travelers stopped in their tracks. Some had been hurrying to catch trains, but they paused, drawn by the unexpected beauty of the music. Their luggage sat forgotten for a few moments as they let themselves listen. The man didn't notice them. He didn't need to. His focus was entirely on the piano, on the sounds flowing from his fingers, on the invisible story he was telling through music. The station guard, who had been walking by, stopped and leaned slightly against a wall. His eyes narrowed, trying to understand the sudden quiet that seemed to settle over the busy station. The announcements from the loudspeakers faded into the background. People usually ignored them, but now it felt as if the world had narrowed to the man and the piano. Even the tapping of shoes on the floor slowed as the rhythm of the music seemed to take over. The vendor at the snack counter wiped his hands on a towel and stepped closer. He had seen many musicians in the station before, some good, some bad, but this was different. There was a strength in the way the man played, a control that came from years of experience. The music didn't feel rehearsed, but it also didn't feel accidental. Every note seemed intentional, and every pause had meaning. The vendor shook his head slightly, not in disbelief, but in admiration. A young woman carrying a backpack stopped mid-step. She had been heading to catch her train, worried about being late, but something made her stay. She leaned against a pillar and let her eyes wander to the man's hands. They moved gracefully, almost effortlessly across the keys. She noticed the way his fingers lifted slightly before striking the notes, the subtle way he shifted his posture with each phrase. It was beautiful, quiet, and precise all at once. The melody shifted again, this time growing more intricate. Chords layered on top of each other, creating a richness that filled the station. People who had never paid attention to piano music before found themselves mesmerized. Some pulled out their phones, recording short clips, not to distract, but because they wanted to remember this moment forever. Others simply watched in silence, letting the music fill their thoughts and emotions. The child, who had been sitting cross-legged on the floor, began to hum along softly, unaware that anyone was listening. His mother smiled, feeling a warmth in her chest that she hadn't felt in a long time. The man didn't glance at them. He played as if the music belonged to no one but him, yet it belonged to everyone who heard it. There was an honesty in his performance, a vulnerability that made the listeners feel connected to him. Even though they had never met him before, some of the people standing in the crowd began to exchange whispers. "Who is he?" one person asked. "How can someone play like this?" Another replied. No one had an answer. His appearance was ordinary. Nothing in his clothes, his face, or his demeanor suggested the extraordinary talent coming from his hands. And yet the music spoke louder than any explanation could. The man shifted into a faster part of the piece. His fingers moved more quickly now, gliding across the keys in a way that seemed effortless. The melody became lively, playful, and bold. People gasped softly, noticing the speed and accuracy of his playing. Some of the musicians who had been walking through the station paused to listen, silently impressed by the level of skill they recognized immediately. The crowd started to grow without anyone realizing it. People who had been walking past slowly stopped and turned their heads. Some sat on nearby benches, while others leaned against walls or luggage carts. The station, usually full of hurried steps and impatient voices, had become a place of stillness and attention. Everyone who stopped felt as though they were sharing a secret, witnessing something rare and precious. Even the commuters, who usually had little patience for delays or distractions, stayed in place. Their tired faces softened. A businessman who had been frowning at his phone moments before now had a calm expression. A young student with books in hand took a deep breath, letting the music ease the stress of exams he hadn't finished preparing for. The melody touched them all in different ways, yet it connected them through a shared experience. The vendor finally stepped back, wiping his palms on his apron. He had worked in the station for years and thought he had seen everything. But today, this man at the piano had changed the ordinary afternoon into something extraordinary. He shook his head slightly and smiled, thinking that some moments were too beautiful to explain. They simply had to be felt. The music continued to grow. with layers of emotion building in waves. At some points it was joyful, at others reflective and soft. Every listener felt something personal in it, as if the man was playing directly into their thoughts and memories. Yet, he was not looking at anyone, not performing for anyone. He was simply expressing something inside himself, something that needed to be shared without words. A young woman with headphones hanging around her neck removed them, drawn in by the sudden intensity of the music. She had been listening to her own playlist, lost in her world, but now she couldn't help but watch. She noticed small details, the way the man's shoulders relaxed with certain phrases, the gentle rise and fall of his head, the quiet determination in his eyes. There was no showmanship, no attempt to impress. It was pure and honest. Even the pigeons that often fluttered near the station roof seemed to pause in their movement. The busy background noise faded, leaving only the piano, the man, and the people listening. It was a rare moment when life seemed to slow down, when time itself felt as though it had taken a breath and waited. The man's melody then took another turn. It became more emotional, more complex. There was a depth in it that made people lean closer, unconsciously drawn into the story he was telling. Some listeners felt a chill, others felt warmth, and many felt a strange mix of both. The music carried feelings that words could not express. The small child, now sitting at the edge of a bench, reached out as if to touch the piano, imagining he could feel the music with his hands. The mother smiled, remembering her own childhood moments of wonder and curiosity. For a few seconds, she was transported back to a simpler time, and the worries of adulthood seemed far away. Even the teenager who had earlier been looking at his phone felt an unfamiliar emotion. The melody made him pause and reflect. It was as if the music reminded him of something he had forgotten, something important. He couldn't put it into words, but he felt grateful for the unexpected pause in his day. The man's hands continued to move across the keys with confidence and grace. There was no rush, but no hesitation either. Each note seemed to matter, each pause carefully measured. The crowd watched in silence, fully absorbed. No one wanted to move, no one wanted to speak. They were all caught in the spell of the music. For some, it was the skill that amazed them. For others, it was the emotion. For everyone, it was the mystery. Who was this man, and why did he play like this? His ordinary appearance made the extraordinary music even more remarkable. People couldn't stop wondering how someone so unassuming could carry such talent. The melody now shifted into a section that felt almost like a conversation. It was lively, playful, yet still graceful. Some listeners swayed gently, following the rhythm without realizing it. Others closed their eyes, letting the music speak to them without distraction. Each person seemed to experience the piece in their own way. Yet there was a shared sense of awe that connected them all. A man sitting on a nearby bench, who had been lost in thought before, leaned forward slightly. He didn't know why, but he felt a sudden sense of hope, a feeling that something good was possible even in the middle of a busy, ordinary day. The music touched him in a way he hadn't expected, and he smiled quietly to himself. As the section ended, the music softened again. The man didn't rush. He let the notes linger in the air, allowing the listeners to feel the echo of what he had just played. The crowd remained quiet, as if they were afraid to break the magic that had formed around the piano. Some people exchanged glances, whispering softly. "Did you see that?" one person asked. "I've never heard anything like this," another replied. Everyone agreed, though no one spoke loudly. The music had created a moment that felt sacred, even in the middle of a busy station. The man continued, shifting once more into a new melody, even richer and more complex than before. The crowd grew slightly larger as more travelers stopped to listen. People who had been rushing to catch trains now hesitated, captivated by the power and emotion of the music. The ordinary afternoon had become extraordinary, all because of one man. The music had filled the station for a long while now, and the crowd that had gathered continued to grow. People were no longer just stopping for a second, they were staying, mesmerized by the sound, by the way the man's fingers moved effortlessly over the keys. The melody had changed again, now flowing with a depth and emotion that felt almost alive. Every note seemed to have a story, every pause a purpose. Listeners could feel something personal in it. Even though they didn't know the man or his life among the crowd, most people were focused entirely on the piano, but a few noticed a new presence. A young woman, quiet and calm, had found a place on a bench a little to the side. She wore a hooded jacket, her face partly hidden, and she sat completely still. Unlike the others, she didn't whisper or move, she simply observed, her eyes fixed on the man's hands. At first, no one paid her much attention. She blended in. Almost invisible to the busy station around her, the child at the front of the small crowd noticed her for a moment and pointed, asking his mother who she was. But she didn't speak. She didn't react. She was just there, watching the music flow like everyone else, yet somehow different. There was something in the way she held herself, a quiet intensity that made the people closest to her glance over. One or two whispered softly, curious about who she might be. As the man continued to play, the melody reached a point of extraordinary complexity. His fingers danced across the keys with precision, yet there was no stiffness, only grace. The notes leapt and flowed like water, moving fast and slow, heavy and light, creating patterns that seemed impossible for anyone to replicate. The crowd gasped silently, as though the music itself had frozen them in place. Their eyes followed every movement of his hands, and their ears drank in every sound. It was at this moment that someone in the crowd froze. A teenager, standing at the back, tilted his head as he watched the woman on the bench. His eyes widened slightly, and a soft gasp escaped his lips. He nudged the person next to him, whispering, Could it be her? The person he whispered to squinted, trying to see who he meant. It was difficult to notice her at first, but once they did, recognition began to spread like wildfire. The woman on the bench was not just any listener. She was a world-famous pianist, someone who had been in the spotlight for years but had recently disappeared from public life. Rumors had circulated about her struggles and her decision to step away from the world of fame and performance, but no one really knew the details. And now, here she was, sitting quietly in a busy station, drawn to the music of a man nobody knew. Word of her presence began to ripple through the crowd. Whispers spread quickly. Is that really her? Someone asked. Another nodded, almost in disbelief. It can't be, a third voice muttered. People's curiosity shifted from the man at the piano to the mysterious woman sitting nearby. And yet, no one wanted to disturb her. The music had created a sacred space where even strangers felt they could not speak too loudly. The man at the piano, of course, did not notice the growing excitement. He continued playing, lost in the sound, in the feeling of the melody flowing from his fingers. But even if he had looked up, he might not have recognized who was sitting there. She was quiet, unobtrusive, almost invisible. And yet her presence carried a weight that made the moment feel even more extraordinary. The woman's eyes never left the man's hands. She recognized the skill immediately. She understood the complexity of the piece, the subtle changes in rhythm, the careful dynamics that turned simple notes into something breathtaking. A part of her wanted to stand up, to applaud, to call out, but she restrained herself. She knew better. This was not a performance for fame or recognition, it was a private expression. And she would honor that. People in the crowd now watched her as much as they watched him. Some were curious, others excited, and a few were quiet in awe. It was unusual, almost magical, to see a person of such fame blend seamlessly into the ordinary world. But what made it even more incredible was the connection forming without a single word. The man played, the pianist listened, and the crowd felt the energy between them without understanding it fully. The melody shifted again, moving into a more tender, reflective section. The notes were soft, but carried emotion that felt almost tangible. The young woman's eyes softened. She leaned slightly forward, drawn into the music even more. A tear threatened to fall, but she blinked it away. The music seemed to speak to her personally, like the man knew what she had been through. Even though they had never met, the child at the front watched her for a moment and whispered to his mother, "She looks sad." The mother simply nodded, unsure how to respond. She didn't need to. The music already conveyed the story in a way words never could. The people around them felt it too. Some closed their eyes, some let their fingers drum lightly on their knees, some simply listened with mouths slightly open. Captivated by the invisible conversation happening between the man and the woman, the man shifted again, moving into a section that was bold and lively. The music became almost playful, a sharp contrast to the tender part that had just passed. His fingers flew over the keys with precision, yet there was a sense of joy in the way he played. It was as if he was telling a story, a tale of life with all its ups and downs. The crowd could feel the energy, the excitement, the passion in each note. Even the famous pianist on the bench smiled faintly. She leaned back slightly but kept her eyes fixed on his hands. She could recognize the nuances of his playing, the pauses, the subtle emphasis on certain notes, the way he shaped the melody so carefully. She realized that this man was no ordinary player. He had a gift, a deep understanding of music that only came from years of dedication and love for the art. The crowd, unaware of exactly who she was, continued to whisper in quiet awe. Some were recording short videos on their phones, others simply stood in silence. No one wanted to disturb the magic that had formed in the station. Everyone felt it, the rare, unspoken connection between the man at the piano and the woman quietly watching, and the way that connection seemed to ripple outward to touch everyone around. A young man, leaning against a pillar, noticed how focused she was. He whispered to his friend, "She's not just anyone. Look at how she's watching. She knows music, really knows it." His friend nodded, eyes widening. They both felt a mix of excitement and respect, unsure if they should speak or stay silent. They chose silence, letting the moment take its natural course. The melody moved on, reaching a section that was powerful yet delicate. Each note had meaning, each chord carried emotion. The young woman's breathing slowed as she closed her eyes for a brief moment, allowing the music to wash over her completely. She could feel the story, the memories, the feelings embedded in the notes. It was as if the man had captured something universal in his playing, something that everyone listening could relate to on a deep, personal level. The man's hands never faltered. He didn't rush, he didn't hesitate, he didn't look up. He was entirely present in the music, and that presence made everyone else feel the same. The crowd, now larger than ever, seemed to sense the magic without understanding it fully. They felt fortunate to witness something rare, something that would stay with them long after the train announcements resumed and the crowd dispersed. The young woman remained still, her eyes opening slowly. She watched the man finish the phrase he was playing, her lips slightly parted in quiet admiration. She could sense the man's dedication, the emotion he put into each note. And she understood on a level few people could, the depth of his talent and the sincerity of his expression. Some in the crowd were beginning to whisper again, now noticing the interaction between the man and the mysterious woman. "Do you see her? Famous, isn't she?" someone asked. Others nodded quietly, eyes wide. The realization that a world-renowned pianist had chosen to sit there, unnoticed at first, added another layer of wonder to the moment. The music flowed again, transitioning into a gentle, reflective section. The child on the floor yawned slightly, lulled by the beauty of the notes. The woman smiled faintly, sensing something comforting in the melody. The crowd felt the music's emotion ripple through them in different ways. Some felt joy, some nostalgia, some a quiet longing, but all shared the feeling of being part of something extraordinary. And still, no one spoke aloud. Words would have ruined the moment. Everyone seemed to understand that some things, like this connection between two musicians, could only be felt, not explained. The music itself told the story more clearly than any voice ever could. The man played. The woman watched, the crowd listened, and the station, once just a busy transit point, became a place of magic. It was as if time had slowed, if only for a few minutes, to allow strangers to share an extraordinary human experience. The man continued to play, and now the music had reached a level of depth that seemed to make time itself slow down. Each note resonated through the station, blending with the faint echoes from the walls and the soft hum of conversations far away. The crowd around him had grown even larger. People who had only been passing through had stopped completely, entranced by what they were witnessing. Their eyes were fixed on his hands, but somehow they also sensed something more, something invisible, something quietly profound. The young woman on the bench did not move. Her eyes, which had been observing his fingers closely, now seemed to absorb the music in a way that went far beyond the surface. Every subtle change in rhythm, every gentle pause, every deliberate touch of the keys drew her in. She didn't just hear the music, she felt it. Each note seemed to speak directly to her, echoing thoughts and emotions she had buried inside. The crowd around them began to notice the intensity of her attention. People whispered quietly, pointing in her direction. "Do you see her? Someone important, isn't she?" They had no idea of her exact identity, but they could sense that she was different. She radiated a quiet strength, a deep understanding of what was happening. And yet, she didn't demand attention. She didn't even seek recognition. She simply listened. The man's melody began to shift again. It became more intricate, more expressive. His fingers moved faster now, yet there was no hint of haste. Each note was intentional, each chord perfectly placed. The rhythm changed subtly, rising and falling like waves in the ocean. The crowd leaned in, almost unconsciously, following the flow of his music. The young woman's eyes widened slightly. She leaned forward, not wanting to miss a single movement of his hands. She could see the story unfolding, and she understood the emotions behind each phrase. For a moment it was as if the two musicians, though strangers, were communicating without words. The man was speaking through his piano, and she was listening, understanding, and responding silently through her presence. The connection between them was invisible but undeniable. People in the crowd began to sense it, though they didn't fully understand what was happening. There was a quiet energy in the air, a tension and beauty that made the station feel almost sacred. The music softened slightly, becoming gentle and introspective. The man's fingers caressed the keys as if he were speaking to someone far away, someone he could not reach in person. The young woman's eyes softened as she watched, her lips barely moving in a small, almost imperceptible smile. It was a look of recognition, of respect, of understanding. She knew what she was hearing, and she knew the depth of skill and emotion it required. The child, who had been sitting near the piano, leaned closer to his mother. "Why is she watching him like that?" he whispered. His mother smiled gently. "Maybe she knows music very well," she said softly. "Sometimes people who love music can feel it more deeply than others." The child nodded, still staring. Sensing that there was something special about the way the two of them were connected, the man's hands began to move with renewed intensity. The melody grew more complex and layered. Chords overlapped, and the rhythm shifted in unexpected but beautiful ways. The crowd gasped softly, realizing that this was no ordinary performance. Some of the commuters who had never paid attention to piano music before were now completely captivated. Some closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them, while others simply stared in awe. The young woman on the bench didn't blink. She had long since stopped thinking about anything else. She was fully present, fully immersed. She could feel the passion, the precision, the care in every note. She could almost sense the man's journey, his practice, his dedication, the countless hours spent perfecting his craft. And yet she sensed something more, a quiet humility, a sense that he was not performing for recognition but simply sharing a part of himself. The energy in the station grew stronger. Even those who had been skeptical or impatient at first found themselves drawn in. The music was no longer just sound, it was emotion made visible. People who had been hurrying to catch trains now felt a strange reluctance to move. They wanted to stay, to witness, to feel this extraordinary moment. It was as if the world had paused for just a few minutes, allowing everyone to share in something rare and beautiful. The man shifted once again, moving into a section of the music that was both bold and tender. The notes leapt and danced, yet there was a softness beneath them. The young woman's eyes glimmered with emotion. She leaned slightly closer, sensing the subtle changes in tempo, the way the music seemed to breathe. She knew instinctively when a pause was coming, when a note would linger longer than expected, and she appreciated the quiet genius in every movement. The crowd watched, fascinated. People whispered quietly, trying to explain what they were feeling. "It's like they're connected," one person said. Another nodded. "I've never seen anything like this. It's almost like the music is speaking to her as much as to us." The connection was palpable, though invisible. The audience could sense the silent communication between the man and the young woman, and it added another layer of awe to the experience. The man's melody became even more intense. His fingers flew across the keys with a speed and accuracy that was breathtaking, yet there was still emotion in every note. The young woman's breathing became slower, deeper. She was absorbing every nuance, every subtle change in tone. She was not just listening. She was feeling, understanding, and silently responding. The crowd, now larger than ever, could feel the intensity too. People who had been strangers moments ago found themselves united by the power of the music. Some closed their eyes, letting the notes wash over them. Others exchanged quiet glances, sharing a moment of mutual wonder. Even the station's background noise, the footsteps, the distant announcements, the rolling suitcases, seemed to fade into nothingness for the young woman. The experience was almost overwhelming. She had seen and heard incredible performances before, but this was different. This was intimate, personal, and sincere. There was no audience, no pressure, no expectation. The man was not performing for fame or praise. He was simply expressing something deeply human, and she recognized it immediately. She could feel the care, the patience, the years of experience behind every note. The child watched the two of them, sensing something he could not name. His mother explained softly, "Sometimes music can tell stories that words cannot, and some people can understand those stories better than others." The child nodded. Still wide-eyed, as if he had witnessed something magical, the man's hands finally slowed, moving into a gentle, reflective section. The notes lingered, almost like they were reluctant to end. The young woman leaned back slightly but did not move her gaze from the piano. She had been completely absorbed, and she now felt a deep sense of gratitude for the moment. She could feel the man's intention, his emotion, his humanity in every sound. The crowd was silent, caught between the ending of the piece and the lingering emotion in the air. No one moved. The magic of the moment held them together. People felt the bond between the two musicians, even without knowing their identities. There was a shared understanding, an unspoken respect for the art and for the human connection it had created. The man finally stopped playing, but he did not immediately rise from the bench. He let the final notes fade naturally, allowing the echoes to settle in the space around them. The young woman remained seated, her hands clasped gently in her lap. She exhaled slowly, as if she had been holding her breath without realizing it. The crowd remained quiet, unsure how to respond to the powerful experience they had just witnessed. The two of them, one playing, one listening, had created a moment that no one present would ever forget. It was not just about music. It was about connection, understanding, and the quiet beauty of human expression. Even strangers could feel it. Even the busiest commuters, the tired workers, the distracted teenagers all felt it. Something rare and extraordinary had unfolded in the middle of an ordinary train station, and no one could deny its impact. The young woman finally moved slightly, giving a small, almost imperceptible nod toward the man. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, of respect, of silent gratitude. The man, still calm, looked in her direction and returned a gentle, warm smile. It was not a smile of surprise, nor of recognition, more like a quiet understanding that this moment had been meant to happen. The crowd, sensing the significance of the gesture, finally began to murmur softly. People exchanged glances, smiles, and quiet words of awe. Some began to clap gently, not wanting to break the delicate energy that had been created, but needing to express their appreciation. The applause was quiet, respectful, and heartfelt, for the man and the young woman. This silent connection was more important than anything else. Words were unnecessary. They had shared an unspoken understanding through music, a conversation that was both private and universal. It was a reminder of how powerful human connection could be, even between strangers, even in the middle of a crowded train station. The music had finally softened to its last notes, lingering in the air like a delicate echo that refused to fade. The man's fingers rested gently on the keys, and for a moment the station seemed to hold its breath. Even the usual bustle of travelers, the clatter of suitcases, the announcements over the loudspeakers, all of it felt distant, as though the entire space had been suspended in time. People in the crowd stayed in their places, unsure whether to speak or move, caught in the quiet magic that had filled the room. The young woman on the bench remained still for a few seconds longer. She exhaled slowly, as if releasing some emotion that had been held inside for a long time. Then, almost hesitantly, she rose from the bench. Every movement was calm, measured, as if she didn't want to disturb the moment, but the energy in the air shifted. The crowd noticed it instantly. Whispers spread quickly. "Is she going to talk to him?" someone asked. "I think she knows him," another whispered. The excitement was quiet but palpable, a delicate tension that made everyone lean closer, even if only in their minds. The woman approached slowly. She didn't rush. She didn't call out. She simply walked with quiet confidence, her eyes fixed on the man at the piano. The man, meanwhile, hadn't moved. He still sat calmly, hands resting lightly on the keys as if he had been expecting this encounter. There was no surprise in his expression, only a gentle, warm attentiveness. The crowd around them held its breath. Some people had taken out their phones to record the moment, but most simply watched in awe, sensing that what was about to happen was rare and meaningful. The station, usually just a place of hurry and noise, felt like it had become a sacred space. Every person there, regardless of why they had come or where they were going, shared in this unexpected and extraordinary moment. When she reached the piano, she paused for a moment. Their eyes met briefly, and in that silent connection, both of them seemed to acknowledge something unspoken but deeply understood. The music had already spoken volumes, and now words were optional. She offered a small, almost shy smile, and the man returned it, calm and steady, a mirror of quiet respect. Finally, she spoke softly, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, yet carried across the attentive crowd. "That was exactly what I needed," she said. There was no performance in her tone, no pretense. It was sincere, honest, and intimate. The man nodded slightly, understanding immediately. He didn't ask why, he didn't question. It was enough that she had listened, that she had been moved, that the music had found its way to her heart. The crowd, though still silent, sensed the intimacy of the exchange. Some people exchanged glances, unable to contain their amazement. They had come to a station to catch a train or go about their daily routines, and yet they had witnessed something far beyond the ordinary. The combination of talent, timing, and human connection had created a moment that would stay with them for years. The woman looked around the gathered people and finally spoke a little louder, though still gentle. "I didn't know anyone would hear it like this," she said. Her words were humble, almost shy, but there was gratitude in them. "Thank you for letting me experience it." The man simply nodded again. He didn't need to reply in words. His music had already communicated everything that needed to be said. Then, slowly, the truth of the connection became clear. The woman stepped closer and in a quiet, almost reverent tone said, You were my first teacher. The one who showed me how to understand music, how to feel it, how to make it alive." Gasps spread quietly through the crowd. Whispers of recognition and surprise rippled outward. People who had not known the identities of either person suddenly realized the depth of the moment they were witnessing. The man's eyes softened. There was a gentle smile on his face, one that carried years of memory, pride, and quiet satisfaction. He had taught many students, but she had been one of the most dedicated and talented. The fact that she had come back into his life, even in this unexpected way, made the music they had shared moments ago even more meaningful. There was no drama, no exaggeration, just an honest human reunion filled with respect and quiet joy. The crowd, sensing the significance, began to respond. A few people clapped softly, unsure if it was appropriate to interrupt the intimate moment, but unable to contain their admiration. The applause grew quietly, not loud or theatrical, but heartfelt. People smiled at one another, sharing a silent understanding that they had been lucky to witness something rare and genuine. Emotional connection between teacher and student. Revealed in a most unexpected setting, the woman continued, her voice warm and calm. I had forgotten how it felt to truly hear music like this, to feel it as you taught me. Thank you for reminding me. Her words carried weight, but there was no sadness, only honesty and appreciation. The man simply nodded. It was enough. Words were not necessary. The music and the shared understanding spoke louder than anything else could. People in the crowd began to approach slightly, respectful of the moment but curious. Some had been moved to tears, others had goosebumps, and many simply felt a quiet happiness. A commuter, leaning against a pillar, whispered to his friend, I've never seen something so pure. It's amazing. The friend nodded quietly, unable to find words. But feeling the truth of the statement deep in his chest, the young woman finally extended her hand slightly, not in formality but in connection. The man reached out, their hands meeting briefly, a gesture full of warmth, acknowledgement, and mutual respect. The crowd watched in silence, sensing the importance of this simple act. It was a human connection made tangible in the smallest yet most meaningful way. For a few moments, the piano sat quietly. The man rested his hands lightly on the keys, and the woman stood beside him, both calm, both grounded in the experience. The crowd, now fully aware of the story, let the silence speak. There was no need for words. They could feel the reunion, the emotion, the shared history. Even if they didn't know the full details, slowly, the young woman turned to face the crowd, offering a small smile. Thank you all, she said softly, for listening, for watching, for sharing this moment with us. The applause grew a little louder, genuine and heartfelt. People clapped not only for the music, but for the connection, for the beauty of the unexpected, for the human story that had unfolded in front of them. The man, still calm and composed, rose from the piano bench. He gave a quiet nod to the woman, who returned it. There was no need for more conversation in that moment. They had shared everything that mattered through music, through presence, and through respect. The crowd slowly began to disperse, still whispering, still amazed. Some people returned to their trains, some continued their day, but all carried a piece of that extraordinary experience with them. The child at the front, who had been watching intently from the beginning, looked up at his mother and whispered, That was the best thing I've ever seen. She smiled, holding his hand, and nodded. Yes, she said softly. It was very special. Remember this moment. The young woman and the man finally walked side by side, exchanging quiet conversation, their voices soft, their laughter minimal but genuine. The station slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but something had changed. The ordinary afternoon had been transformed into an extraordinary memory, not just for the teacher and student, but for every single person who had been present. It was a reminder that human connection, shared through art, through music, or through a simple act of presence, could create moments that were unforgettable. It didn't matter that they were strangers. It didn't matter that it happened in a busy train station. It mattered that they were present, that they witnessed something genuine and beautiful, and that they allowed themselves to feel it. And as they left the station, the crowd slowly returned to their routines, but everyone carried a quiet sense of awe and warmth. The man had played a piece of himself through the piano, and the world had paused just long enough to notice. The young woman had returned quietly without fanfare, to experience that connection, and in doing so, reminded everyone that some moments are far greater than the sum of their parts. The music had ended. The crowd had dispersed, but the memory lingered. People would tell stories of that afternoon, of the quiet man and the mysterious woman, of the music that held them still, and of the connection that had touched hearts without a single word. It was a perfect example of how life can surprise, inspire, and move us when we least expect it, and how true human moments filled with respect, emotion, and presence can leave a mark on everyone who witnesses them.